tell you, this week's podcast here, this has been really one big fun walk through my childhood with the tabloid talk shows, coming up, the myths that you believed as a kid, and this segment here, things I remembered about school back when I first started that are just different from today. I haven't been in school in now 28 years, high school, and I had nieces that have graduated high school, nephews that have graduated high school, and I know what they told me about how their school days and years were. They would look at me like I had three heads when I would tell them, back in my day, this is how school was. And after I got over the fact that I was old enough to be talking like that, I started to really think. I wanted to make an actual list of things I remembered from school that I knew at least weren't as relevant as they were back in the 80s. I'm thinking that some of these things I bring up will be relevant only to kids that went to school in the 80s or maybe early 90s. Some will be a little more overarching, where those of you that went to school in the 70s and 60s might feel the same way. But let's just get started with the honorable mentions. There are honorable mentions, and the top 5 is in no particular order. And you'll have to let me know if I forgot anything. I tried my best to do my research, but eventually I said I think I got all the fun ones, but who knows? So, honorable mentions for things that were different about school in the 1980s include the super awesome laser pattern photos you could get. I think I did it 2 years in a row. Those really didn't age well, but I digress. There was also typing class, where you learned how to type on a typewriter, not a computer keyboard. There was also way more of an emphasis on lunchboxes, lunchbox culture. The lunchbox that you had said a lot about who you were, what you enjoyed. I'm not saying lunchboxes aren't a thing still now, but it felt like in the 80s into the early 90s that sometimes having the right or wrong lunchbox could make or break your popularity. Another honorable mention was that famous cart that would get rolled into your classroom with the big old TV on it so you could watch either Reading Rainbow, 3-2-1 Contact, maybe some kind of learning show on PBS. And the last honorable mention was having to take the presidential fitness test and get the Presidential Fitness Award. This was held in schools from the late 1950s through the early 2010s and consisted of things like pull-ups, sit-ups, 50-yard dash, things like that. Did you ever have to take the Presidential Physical Fitness test in school? Well, those are the honorable mentions. Let's get into the actual top 5. We'll kick it off with number 1, film strips. Ah, yes, film strips, that muted brownish yellow color film shown up on the projector, but you had to turn it when it would beep. So many kids would raise their hands wanting to be the one that turned the film strip. These were just basic early education film strips. Take notes on it or just watch it. Film strips were seen as a cheaper alternative to full motion picture film. They were popular from the 20s all the way into the 80s. So this is one I'm assuming that any of you that went to school in the 50s through the early 90s would remember film strips. But early 90s, that was kind of the end with the advent of the VCR. And like I said in the honorable mentions, the cart with the TV on it, that kind of did in film strips. And they faded away quickly as the 80s ended. Number 2 is penmanship class. Any of you out there take penmanship class in school? I had a penmanship teacher, Mr. Moran. He would come, God, I don't know if it was once a month or once every other week, but he would teach us cursive. Yes, cursive handwriting, not cursive fonts so you can make it look like a signature. Actual cursive, where the letter Q looks like the number 2 and such. Naturally, this was bigger when writing letters was the main thing and taking notes with a pen and a notebook was a thing. With the advent of texting on phones and email and the computer in general, penmanship has become less relevant. I was always proud of my cursive skills, and now it's something that's useless. Like, I can't put that on a resume. Can write nicely. That's not to say that penmanship class is gone. There are still some states that have penmanship, cursive writing as mandatory in school curriculum, which I think is good. What if the apocalypse comes and the computers go down? How are you going to write notes to send with someone to save you? Number 3, and this is very 80s, the Apple II computer along with green-lined computer paper. Back in episode 153, I talked about the Oregon Trail PC game. Well, we played that in the 1980s on an Apple II computer. The Apple II was an innovator as far as home personal computers went. And I remember when I saw them in my school, South Yarmouth Elementary, I thought we had won the lottery or something. Because from the time I first used a computer in school in probably 1985, it was another 11 years before we got a computer in my house. Obviously, compared to what you have now, your smartphone probably has more power than the Apple II did in the early 1980s. But when the options before were no computers, this was ahead of its time. Then if you wanted to print out a paper or something from the computer, you had the paper. It was white and green lined, like thick lines. Can you see it in your head? With the perforated holes on the side, and you can hear the noise that the old computer printers would make. But it was the coolest thing to be 7, 8, 9 years old and to be able to print out something from a computer. The current generation that grew up with smartphones, they'll look back at that and hear me waxing nostalgic about green and white computer paper and say, God, what was wrong with you? But we didn't have smartphones then, so this was brand new. In another 40 years, kids of that generation are going to look back at these smartphones and say, oh, you had to hold your phone in your hand and have it implanted in your eyes or something. But we'll move on from potential Big Brother scenarios to number 4, walking home from school. Obviously, kids still walk home from school. There are kids that live within a few hundred yards of their school if they live in cities or suburbs. But I think this speaks more to the society and culture at the time in the 1980s that kids walking anywhere wasn't seen as an invite for them to get kidnapped. I didn't live close enough to my school when I was in elementary school to have even had the option of walking home. But in middle school, I did it all the time. I used my Google Maps skills and just did a little bit of measurement to see. It was about 1.5 miles for me to walk from Mattakese Middle School to my house. But when you're 11, 12 years old, parents out there, could you imagine if your kids lived 1.5 miles from school, letting them walk home? Now, granted, I walked mostly through the woods, but still there were dangerous owls that could have swooped down and stolen my backpack, so you never know. That is a sort of true story. One time I was walking home with my friend Hassan, and we saw an owl in a tree, a big old owl. And knowing that owls, if they attack you, will go for the highest point on your head, namely your eyes, he and I grabbed tree branches like we were taught in school, so that if the owls swooped, they would attack the branch and not our faces. But enough of owl attacks. Let's move on to the final part of the top 5 things different about school in the 1980s. And that is number 5, encyclopedias and the Dewey Decimal System as far as research goes. I know that's a lot of words right there. Basically, it's how you would research papers in school in the 1980s. No Google, no Wikipedia, no laptops, no Wi-Fi. It was physical encyclopedias or looking up actual books using the Dewey Decimal System in the library. Do any of those words make sense to you younger listeners? Encyclopedia, Dewey Decimal. I'll even go as far as in college having to use microfilm and microfiche to look up old newspaper archives. It's so much easier now to just go to the site that's digitized them. Research was so much different and so much harder in the 1980s. And because I went through it in the 80s and 90s, it makes me appreciate how much easier it is for me to research and write articles or podcast notes today. All the way back in episode 24, I talked about the Zennial generation, which was kind of a hybrid Gen X and Millennial. this little strip of years, 1977 to 83, and I fall into that. And a big part of being a Zennial was being old enough, growing up long enough without technology and the advancements so that you remember life before, but you also appreciate what you have now. And that's how I feel. If all the technology went away, I could probably amuse myself for a while, but I'm so glad we have it. So that wraps up the top 5. Those of you that went to school in the 80s or before, do you remember any of these things? Film strips, penmanship class, the Apple II computer and its fun green-lined computer paper, walking home from school like it was nothing, or encyclopedias and the Dewey Decimal System for research. I've said it a million times on this podcast, but I'm so glad I grew up when I did.